This is David Dubal, and it's my great pleasure to have as my guest Robert Starr. It's not exactly easy to characterize what kind of composer you are, I mean nationality, because you were born in Vienna, then you lived in Israel, and you live in America. So, in a way, we can say that Robert Starr, who is celebrating this year his 60th birthday on this planet, and he's had a very good year, he's told me, we can characterize him as a international composer.
I don't know. I think of myself as an American, really.
Now you're an American?
I was 23 when I came here.
I see.
And I've spent most of my adult life here. Of course, Vienna lurks in the background.
Well, Vienna lurks. You were there a long time.
I was 14 when I left Vienna. And I spent my formative years in what was then called Palestine.
Yes.
It's before the State of Israel was formed. So these are important years. But I think I've spent the bulk of my adult life in America.
And is America a good country to be a composer in?
I'm here of my own choice. Mm-hmm. I mean, I came here to study, and I chose to stay here.
When you were growing up in Vienna, did you know that you would be a composer?
No, I began as a pianist.
Mm-hmm.
I was a pianist. I was admitted to the State Academy at the age of 13, and I did improvise in secret, but I think if nothing else had happened, I might have become a pianist.
Well, what I really meant is a young boy walking the streets of Vienna knowing that Schubert and Mozart and Beethoven were there before you. For instance, Aaron Copland, growing up in Brooklyn, I don't know that he had any feelings that on the streets any composers had lived.
I see what you say.
Yeah.
No, in that sense, Vienna was a lovely town to
Yes.
grow up in, of course. And I did improvise from a very, very early age, but it was not encouraged. It was considered sort of a waste of time by my mother.
And, well, I think that's the problem with a lot of young creative people in music. Their parents or the teachers wants them to play certain pieces very well and learn certain courses in harmony or counterpoint. And what happens is there's no finger painting, so to speak.
Exactly, yes. But it took, when I came to Jerusalem, I had Joseph Tal was my teacher.
Very famous Israeli composer.
And he is really the man who gave me the courage who told me, first of all, that improvising was not a criminal act. And then that if something good came, I should jot it down. And in a sense, I made my switch somewhere around age 15, 16, 17, 18.
And no regrets?
No, I also had always trouble with memory. In other words,
as a pianist, yes.
Even as a student. So I think it was a happy switch, and I made it early in life. Tal also told me I would not make a living as a composer. And
very few composers make a living as a composer.
I did make my living as an accompanist for a great many years.
Mm-hmm.
And also learned another instrument at one time, briefly.
Well, Joseph Tal said to you, you can't necessarily make a living as a composer, and as most musicians who are composers, they have to become teachers, and you have done that, and you've done many other things. Well, when you hear that a Michael Jackson, for instance, is selling 100 million albums of Thriller, how do you feel? Of course, Beethoven could never, in his wildest dreams, be asked this question because there was no Thriller, there was no MTV, there was no records, and there was certainly no marketplace at that time. I wonder if Beethoven were here, if he would answer differently than you, and now I want to hear your answer.
I must tell you that I am firmly convinced that the audience for serious music was always small.
Mm-hmm.
I do not think that most Viennese of Beethoven's time, I mean, we know they did not hear his music. If you go to all the places where wine is drunk in the suburbs of Vienna, you're not going to hear Beethoven there.
Mm-hmm.
Now you hear American rock because it dominates the world. I would think that serious music has always attracted, I think, less than 10 or 15% of the population, and popular music the rest.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the world has changed that much. Maybe the popular musicians didn't make as much money as Michael Jackson is doing today because the media have developed so much. If anything, I would think we have today more of an audience for serious music than perhaps Mozart of Beethoven's time, because it was really limited to the aristocracy and
Really was, yes.
and the intelligentsia of the bourgeoisie eventually.
Yes. Yes.
And today, with music being taught at universities, which is also a new thing in an American development, I mean, I'm guessing, but I would think we have perhaps even a slightly larger audience for so-called serious music today than 100 or 150 years ago.
Very interesting. The fact is that when Chopin perhaps gave his first recital and he was planning to leave for America, nothing was working. If a Rothschild was in the audience, he could possibly get students from that connection, and there would be no more than 250, 300 people to come to any debut, and still a career could be developed. Mozart never expected to sell more than 250 subscriptions to his piano concertos. So perhaps you are right. Of course, there are also, I have read recently, more horses than ever before in the history of the world. So there's more of everything. So
I do think radio and recording has changed, has made music more easily available. For instance, I mean, if you live in a very small town in this country, you couldn't have heard good
you
music.
can hear your music.
And now you can hear everything, everywhere, if you are interested. And I think the availability of it is wonderful.
Have you heard your music on radio? And if you have, and I'm sure you have, is it a certain kind of thrill and excitement knowing that...
It frankly is. If you drive and then suddenly open the radio and say, oh, what are they playing here? It's a thrill.
Yeah.
It is. And it is always unexpected.
Unexpected.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So in a way, you have told me that it's not a bad world to be in for.
I think it's a lovely world to be in.
And to be a composer.
Yes. I mean, I wouldn't do it if I didn't most thoroughly enjoy it.
Well, so many people do things out of pain, though. We've always heard the composer is writing because psychologically he must.
Yes.
Is that part?
Yes,
that part?
absolutely,
You have
absolutely.
to express yourself musically.
You do, but that doesn't mean that all music is painful. I mean, some music is very pleasurable, and I think some music has to be both pleasurable to the composer and to the listener.
Robert Starr is my guest on this program, and we're going to hear three works. His work has been on WNCN frequently, and these three, though, today, have never been heard on this
They've
station.
never been recorded.
Yes. They're new recordings, and we're going to start with 5 preludes for piano. Now, I know very well a pianist who thinks of your music as very special. His name is David Bar-Ilan.
He's the most important pianist in my life. He has played a second piano concerto. He commissioned the third piano concerto. But unfortunately, they have not yet been recorded. There's been talk of it, but it hasn't happened yet.
But it will.
We
I
hope
think
so.
so. Well, I know David, and he's a formidable man in every way, and loves your music. These recordings of your piano music are on Protone, correct? Who's the artist?
The artist is a young woman named Roberta Rust, whom I did not know personally until she wrote me a letter saying that she was recording these pieces and could you come and play them for me. And I said I'd be delighted to hear them. She is a native Texan and she is half Indian.
Wonderful.
Of the Sioux tribe and very proud of it, and is a very forceful, very fine pianist.
And
I think
you're
I was
pleased with
delighted.
her performance?
Yes, I had very little to say to her when she played them for me. A few things here and there. Good musicians usually know what to do, but they like to check with the composer before recording, and I think it's a good idea.
Yes, it is a good idea, although there are pianists that have said that I go to play for the composer. Harold Bauer said this once.
Yes.
And I come away absolutely each time with learning nothing.
Did he say that?
Yes.
May I ask for whom he played?
Debussy.
Really?
Yes.
And Debussy?
He premiered the Children's Corner as well as Undine of Ravel, which is dedicated to him.
Did Ravel not say anything?
No.
Maybe he was pleased.
Very pleased, I guess.
Yeah. Well, if you're pleased, you just shake hands and go.
I must tell you that as a pianist, coming to the composer would be a terrifying moment for me, though. How come? Lack of confidence, perhaps? Because there's such a separation now between the performer and the composer.
Yes, there is too much. There should
Yes.
be less of one. I think too many composers are at fault even in having separated themselves from performers and from performing. I think the split is unhealthy. I would think any pianist who firmly believes in his own interpretation may be afraid that the composer would disagree. Then you have a problem, so to speak, if you're a pianist with strong convictions. And now I, as a composer, am sometimes willing to accept someone's concept of my music if it is strong and convincing, even if it is not quite what I had in mind, because I love to be interpreted. As long as the interpreter has personality, ideas, I don't mind. But there are composers who believe that there's only one way of playing their music, and then I think you'd really have a problem or a conflict.
Yes, and that's where, by the way, I would feel that fear in coming to a composer I didn't know. I'd been attracted to a score, and I learned it, and then I would come. And if the composer had one specific conception and I deviated, I would just feel very bad.
But it's been my experience that I've almost rarely been totally misunderstood. Little things, you know. I also like performers who, for instance, when they get excited, speed the tempo up a little bit, right? Some of them have asked me, are you very strict about your metronome markings? And my answer is no. I actually don't like the metronome. And of lately, I give only an indication between such and such and such and such, because on some sunny day, I will put a nice metronome marking on a piece, and the next day, if it's gloomy and hazy, I'll come out with a slow. So I don't even believe in an absolute definitive tempo. Also, a piece to a large audience must be played differently from a small room. I think all these elements affect performance, and they're part of life, and I think they should be enjoyed.
Well, these are important comments coming from a celebrated contemporary composer. We're so... I think performers are fearful of what they're doing with a text, and they really think that every dot and dash is so sacred that they imprison themselves within the score.
They have been taught that, and perhaps sometimes too rigidly. The composers who really want to do that have of lately gone to the tape and to the computer directly. In other words, eliminated an entire world, that of human contact and that of interpretation of music, and I have not gone that way.
Human contact, I would say, is important to live.
I would
relate.
rather be slightly misinterpreted than just work alone into tape, so I have not gone that way. I also see no really future of music in it.
We're going to hear Robert Starr's 5 Preludes for Piano, and what is your relationship with the piano per se? You have some output, but you have an output in almost every field.
I have written for piano. I've written 3 concerti, I've written 2 sonatas and a number of short pieces. I've written a number of teaching works for piano, which I find are being used widely, particularly sketches in color. And then I wrote a set of piano pieces fairly recently, which are called At Home Alone. And they're dedicated to people who, when they are at home alone, play the piano.
Oh, that's a rarity.
There are
these
some
days.
left.
Yeah, there are some left. Well, let's hear Roberta Rust in the 5 Preludes for Piano, and they were composed in 1964.
Correct.
You have just heard Roberta Rust in a performance of the 5 Preludes for piano by my guest, Robert Starr, and it's a Protone recording. Robert Starr is celebrating his 60th birthday throughout this year, and he has had many performances. Indeed, we'll be hearing a new recording of his violin concerto very shortly. I'd love to ask you, Mr. Starr, how do you work? What does a composer do? Do you dream, perhaps, music and you get up and notate it? Do you, like Beethoven, write little kernels and develop it? Do you go in the woods and become inspired, or not wait for inspiration?
All those things.
All those things.
I dream
suspected
music almost every night.
Really?
Sometimes quite painfully because it's repetitious. Sometimes it's like an obsession. I do not notate those down because I don't treat them as final results. I think they're often the mind working out something. Because once I did notate them down, and the next morning they didn't look nearly as good as they had in the middle of the night. But an idea in itself does need at least retouching, if not reshaping. And so far I've not had trouble in sort of lack of ideas. I mean, I love to walk in the woods, but it's not necessarily for me the way to if I don't have any ideas on a certain day, I don't write. I do not believe in forcing that thing. I know it may come. I sometimes do not write for several weeks and then write a piece very quickly, which does not mean that my mind didn't. My mind sort of worked on it all those weeks.
The unconscious is constantly moving in it.
I think so, but I do think music and dream music practically.
How interesting.
All the time.
You know, in Berlioz's memoirs, he talked about, he composed a magnificent symphony one night in his dream, and he got up in the morning, and he could not find the time, because to make a living, he had just gotten married. To make a living, he had to do hack work and copying music out at the Paris Conservatory, and he writes that, a great symphony, went down the tube, so to speak. But I think really he didn't mean that. It doesn't happen like that. I think he was just doing that for effect.
I don't know if he could dream an entire symphony in one night. He was a very lucky man indeed. Yeah. I don't. I dream short ideas, which then often repeat themselves.
Brahms said the ideas come from heaven, and then the hell of working them out.
I don't know where the ideas come from, and I don't really want to know, as long as they keep coming. I would worry if they'd stop coming. Then I would have to try to find out where they are coming from. But luckily this hasn't happened yet. So I don't need to know where they come from, as long as they keep coming.
They are there. Why would someone have musical ideas? Another would perhaps see the world more visually. Another would write.
Well, I have for instance, I'm not a visual person at all. Sometimes I'm asked, what did so-and-so wear? I have no idea. Even when I'm involved in the theater and the set designers and sort of people ask me questions, I have often admitted that I don't think visually. I really think sound.
Yes. And so that was from the beginning of your life?
I've always been like that. Yeah, I try to train myself, but you can only train yourself to a certain extent. By instinct, I live sound rather than visual things. I remember I once wrote a theatrical piece, and I had the notion there was a jury, a situation of a chorus sitting on stage being a jury. And the set designer was a costume designer, was a very well-known man. I said I should like them to wear masks, because I wanted them to be anonymous. He asked me a simple question: do you want them to wear identical masks or a different mask each? And I had never thought about it. He explained to me what the two would mean. That identical mask means that they're all uniform and they're thinking the same. And like a child, it had to be explained to me. Then we made our choice. We ended up not using masks, which had been my ideas. He sort of talked me out of it. But it showed me at the time that I was not a visually thinking person. So
sound is your medium. What about when you walk the streets of New York? What do you feel?
I mean, I can sleep, for instance, whether it's dark or light makes no difference to me. But if there's sound, I cannot sleep.
Cannot sleep.
Yeah.
So what about the subway noises and the...
Oh, they're very irritating, yes.
Was it John Cage who said all noise is equal?
It may be to him. To me, it's not. I mean, there are pleasant noises and
what's a pleasant noise?
Oh, anything natural, I think.
Anything natural.
Yeah. In the country, being woken up by birds, I think.
That could never
it's
disturb
lovely.
you.
No, I mean, I hate to be woken up at 5:15.
Even by a blue jay, yeah.
Which is when they get up these days. But I always smile.
They're living.
But there's a truck around the corner, which may be 4:30 in the morning, I would be annoyed.
Now, I have a problem with hammerjacks, and it's a major problem because every time I see anyone, digging up the, I'm crazed. It goes through my nervous system like it's so painful, this noise. We were talking about you could possibly get an idea walking in the woods. Think of Beethoven taking one of our subways. He would hear again, perhaps.
No, but what I find difficult to deal with is music, the kind of music that should be ignored, but is there. I would sit with people, non-musicians, in a restaurant, and I might recognize the piece they're playing, or I would say, it just modulated to the subdominant, and they would look at me as though I were crazed, because they were involved in some discussion topic, and while I listened to them discuss whatever it was, I also heard that awful music out of the speaker modulating. I cannot help it.
Amazing.
I cannot exclude sound from my consciousness if it is present.
I understand that. And
I think most musicians probably suffer from that. I don't think it's unique. But as a composer, one is doubly sensitive. And I'm also irritated by people who, when they hear that a musician is coming for dinner, put on the late Beethoven quartets or the Goldberg variations.
Oh, yes.
Thinking that he would love to hear that while he eats his soup. And
very profound entertainment.
And I have a friend who told me that when he goes to his accountant, the accountant always switches to Mozart, because this customer's coming. And he said to him, I can either listen to you or to Mozart, but I cannot listen to both at the same time.
Oh, wonderful.
So sound to be excluded is a problem.
Yes. Now, since you think dream live in sound, do you think that that's a genetic happening? Was music in your family?
There has been, but I think there's nothing one can do about it. I sometimes curse it.
We're going to hear now, if you don't mind, Robert Starr, the slow movement. We don't have time. We're just giving a taste of your vast output on this program. But the slow movement of your recent violin concerto, which is recorded on Angel by Itzhak Perlman and Ozawa, I believe, conducting the Boston Symphony. Well, tell me about this very major long work of yours.
Well, that is a very different situation from those piano preludes which I just wrote and which a stranger recorded. That violin concerto was written specifically for Itzhak Perlman and took that into consideration. To me, he's a truly great violinist, and I am particularly enamored of his sound. For the program notes in Boston, I wrote that his sound emanates directly from his soul. That's not a very modern way of saying things, but I mean it. And his technique is superb, of course. In fact, when he first read through the piece, he said only once, I think I'll have to practice this.
And, of course, his technique is superb, and his humor is also.
Yeah. But it's his sound that I love.
So you were thinking of him during the creation of the work?
Yes.
And are you pleased with the performance?
Yes. Yes, very.
Rather ridiculous question to ask, because what if you weren't? That would be a shame. Think of it.
Well, that's unlikely in this case. But I'm very fond of the violin, but I have not written that much for the violin. It's my first and I think my only.
Were there any difficulties in writing? Did you call in a Joseph Joachim, as Brahms did for his concerto?
No, I went over it with each movement.
Did he say something was awkward?
No, he didn't. No, he didn't. I didn't do any changes.
So interesting. Well, let's hear this middle movement. I have never heard it. Our audience has not heard it. It's on Angel Records, and the Boston Symphony. Seiji Ozawa conducts, the soloist Itzhak Perlman. Robert Starr's violin concerto, the slow movement. Robert Starr Violin Concerto, the second and third movements. We had time to hear, Robert, the third movement, so that's why I included it. Itzhak Perlman, the violinist, Boston Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Ozawa in that Angel recording of Starr's Violin Concerto. We'll be right back after this message or two. This is David Dubal, and my guest is Robert Starr. Well, I'm going to give you the choice now of talking about, for 1 minute, anything you want to. You can talk about what kind of strategy it takes to be a composer in our society. Obviously, there are many young composers, and sometimes they're wondering, how do I get published? How do I get performed? How do I live? That's a big topic.
It's a big topic. I think there's such a great variety of possibilities in the life of a composer, and the range of the things he can do, from, let's say, writing for such top professionals as Perlman and the Boston Symphony, to choruses, which are essentially amateurs, or writing for special groups, such as brass groups, writing for dance, which I've done quite a bit of actually in my time, writing for the musical theater, writing simple pieces for children to play, writing for the solo piano. There's an infinite variety of possibilities, and I think when you're young you should do all of them, and I think when you get older you should still do all of them. There's only one principle I have established as after my 60th birthday, which is I from now on prefer to write works I have never written before, both in idiom and in any. I do not want to do things I have done. Time is now limited and is getting a little shorter than it was when I was 23. And I like to do things. For instance, I've never written a piano trio, so I have decided to write one and found a very pleasant group for whom I'm writing it. And a few other things I have never written, I want to do those in preference to, let's see, one more such and such, which I have already done. That's why I also said this is my one and probably my only violin concerto. I do not see myself writing another. Also, after writing for Martha Graham, I have not written for dance anymore. So there are some doors one closes in one's life, but there's still lots of new doors
Has
opening.
there been any form, I know you've written 3 symphonies, for instance, right? Any form that you have loved more, or any specific combination?
Well, I work fastest, let me put it this way, when I have either text or a theatrical situation. Because when there is a human angle, the ideas come more quickly than if I'm asked. For instance, I wrote a piece for Gerald Schwartz this year, which I called Concerto Quattro, for oboe, clarinet, bassoon, and horn, solo with string orchestras and one percussionist. And he played it both in Los Angeles and New York. And there I went simply from the I hate the word situation, but the sound situation, so to speak, that I was confronted with. But it's different. Another work I wrote this year was I wrote a work for voice called Songs of Youth and Age, because I'm obviously at the moment interested in the juxtaposition between the two, and I simply looked for suitable texts the moment I found them. So to answer your question as best as I can, I respond more quickly to a dramatic, theatrical, or word situation, but it doesn't mean I don't enjoy writing a piece for violin and orchestra.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, we were discussing before ideas and sources and so forth. What about a composer? It always seemed to me that a composer that listened to a great many other composers could get in trouble. Their ear becomes eclectic. Do you, as a composer, gravitate to the not too many composers of your time? For instance, you'd like to listen to Stravinsky, Schoenberg, I don't know, Brahms, Beethoven, or would you rather just leave the ear alone and forget about listening to other music?
If you want a very honest answer, I don't listen to very much music.
I wouldn't either.
I'm just too busy.
Yeah.
But
if
if
I wouldn't either if I were a composer. I'd be a little frightened that the ear would and the unconscious would start blending certain of these elements of others together, and that I wouldn't really know what I was.
Well, I do believe that almost everything new should be exposed to the audience, but I don't have to personally go and hear it.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if I hear something that I truly like, if there's, for instance, a sound that somebody else heard before me, I do not hesitate to use it.
Yes.
A sound cannot be copyrighted.
Yes.
And it's funny how quickly, a new sound, a good one, gets incorporated into the musical language.
Mm-hmm.
By, if a new thing is found, whereas some really silly ideas disappear. For instance, there was a time when somebody had the idea of having clarinets clap with their fingers on the, on the empty.
Mm-hmm.
And, that disappeared within a couple of years. But some really good new sounds have entered the musical language. And they should be used by everybody. They are public property.
Yes, public property. Profiles in sound. We're going to hear this brass quartet work of yours, the last three movements at least of the five-movement work, the Angelic Bride, the Militant, and Hell Eve. Tell me just a second about this piece.
In 1976 or thereabouts, Martha Graham asked me to write a ballet for her, which was called Holy Jungle, and was based on paintings of Hieronymus Bosch. The ballet did not survive its initial season, I mean. And I had used a little bit of brass, and I excerpted 5 short movements, rewrote them, but used Martha's titles, which are very colorful, and called them Profiles in Brass. And the group that recorded them, it's a group that has played much of my music, the Metropolitan Brass Quartet. And they're awfully good, I think. So this is a very new recording. I think it's just been released.
Well, we're going to hear this recording, these last 3 movements of the 5 movements, Profiles in Brass and the Metropolitan Brass Quartet are indeed here the performers. You have just heard three movements from Profiles in Brass, performed by the Metropolitan Brass Quartet. They are by my guest tonight, the celebrated American composer, Robert Starr. Mr. Starr, it's been wonderful talking to you, and I wish you a wonderful 60th year.
I thank you so much. It's been truly a pleasure to be here and talk to you.
Thank you. This is David Dubal. Thank you for listening.